Why are other operating systems which have GNU software on them not called GNU slash whatever the name of that operating system is? Well, let's first start by why is GNU+Linux called a GNU system? In 1984, Richard Stallman started the GNU operating system, and ever since then it has been developed further, and then in 1991 Linus Torvalds made a kernel, but it was proprietary at that time, so in 1992 he relicensed it to be a free software kernel. So those two projects basically were combined, and effectively the Linux kernel completes the GNU operating system, a variant of the GNU operating system. So GNU has its own kernel herd, but because Linux was finished first, it was used in the operating system, and it does work, so it does complete a variant of the GNU operating system. So anyway, that's why it's a GNU+Linux system, because it is a direct continuation of the GNU project started by Richard Stallman in 1984. GNU+Linux is the GNU operating system. It's the same project still, basically. It just now includes a different kernel. If you use the GNU operating system, for example, Debian GNU herd, then that's just the GNU operating system with its own kernel, but GNU operating system with its... GNU with Linux, it's basically still a valid GNU implementation, because at the time herd wasn't yet ready, so basically the Linux kernel served as the kernel for the GNU operating system, so it is the GNU operating system, is what I'm trying to say, and have said. Also, that's why it's called GNU+Linux, because it is literally the GNU operating system, started by Richard Stallman in 1984, announced in 1983. So, then there is a big misunderstanding now that I have explained why the name is actually GNU plus Linux, because there's the kernel, but there's misunderstanding why the GNU is in the name. A lot of people seem to think that it has something to do with compilers or something like that, in that the Linux kernel is compiled with the GNU compiler or something like that, and then the name GNU comes from that or something. I'm not exactly sure what they even... Where does this misunderstanding come from? I have no idea. But some people seem to say nonsense like that. It might just be a straw man argument, though. A lot of people just say it just to make the GNU/Linux name look bad, because the name supposedly makes no sense. Well, of course it doesn't make sense if that's your reason. It has to be compiler, but I don't know where the fucking thing comes from. I have no idea who ever came up with that stupid myth that the GNU is in the name because of the compiler. That makes no sense. It's in the name because it's literally the GNU operating system. Microsoft Windows has Windows in the name because it is the Windows operating system. Apple's macOS has macOS in the name because it is the macOS operating system. So, of course, GNU is in the name because it is the GNU operating system. So that's the reason, but the misunderstandings, they are just weird. There are also some other misunderstandings, like, well, actually I don't need to get into them. Let's just move on to the actual topic. The actual topic is that the other operating systems which use GNU software, there might be some operating systems that include some GNU software at a later date. Well, okay, let's say that the Apple Mac OS has some GNU software added in at a later date after like it has been developed into an operating system. It has now some like some software gets added in over the years. Okay. Does that make it a GNU operating system? Well, no, because there's a crucial difference between the Mac OS and its use of some GNU software that was added in versus GNU+Linux, which is literally the GNU operating system. GNU+Linux has GNU in the name because it is the GNU operating system. So GNU software wasn't added in to an existing operating system. It is the GNU operating system. Basically, like, operating systems can interchange software and include other operating system software and combine and mix and match them. That's just normal. But that's no reason to just name every operating system and have like every other operating system's name in the operating system's name, because that's just nonsense. Then there's no way to differentiate between operating systems if every operating system has the name of every other operating system, because the operating systems source their software from so many different sources. That's just nonsense to include every software program in the name, because the operating system, I mean, let's say the Mac OS. Go back to the Mac OS. The Mac OS, it has its own origin as being like the next operating system, and the FreeBSD and whatever else might have been used for the Mac OS. So it has its own roots in those projects like the Next and FreeBSD and all that, whatever. So Mac OS isn't a GNU operating system because it's not a derivative of the GNU operating system, even if it includes some software that was included over the years. So it doesn't make it a GNU operating system. But GNU+Linux, it doesn't have its own history outside of the GNU operating system plus Linux that was added in. If you trace back the development to the furthest you can go, you can see that there is the GNU operating system. GNU operating system is basically the point of origin. That's where it all starts. And that's where the name comes from. So Richard Stallman started the operating system, GNU, and ever since then, everything that's added into it, it doesn't change the name. And this is also why it is a ridiculous and stupid thing to say that some people say on the internet, and I hate it because it is so stupid. They say this nonsense that like, well, it's just, they mock the name GNU/Linux because it includes more things than they would like to be included in the name. So they mock that by including everything, like on their system, like all the desktop environments and the web browser even, and all these system programs, all these this, that, and the other. You've seen them probably. I don't know. They exist on the internet. You can go find them, like those comments where, well, I use this GNU/this/this/this/this, that, and the other, and all these other programs. So they basically list all the software on their system. Now that is stupid. But the reason the GNU is in the name, that is another of those misunderstanding that I was talking about, that I didn't want to get into yet back then, but now I'm getting into this misunderstanding. So this is another of those misunderstandings. They misunderstand why GNU is in the name. It's not in the name because it's just another software on the system. No, it is the GNU operating system. GNU is the point of origin. GNU is the start. GNU is everything there is to it, basically. Well, not everything, because like there is other software added in, but GNU is the start. It is the GNU operating system. If you add some software to it and make a distribution of it, and you include some other software with it, it doesn't change the name. So that's also why the macOS, if it includes some GNU software, it doesn't make it like a macOS / GNU or something like that. It doesn't make it like that because it's operating systems, they include a lot of software, and often it's from many different sources. So you can't possibly include every software in the name, and that makes no sense. So you have to pick a name. And the name of the GNU operating system is GNU, and it stands for GNU's not Unix. And if you have difficulty pronouncing it, GNU, for some reason, pronounce it as GNU. 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 That's not difficult to pronounce. That's perfectly normal pronunciation in the English language. So if you have difficulty pronouncing GNU for some reason, then just say GNU. Yeah. Of course it's nonsense that like, oh, it's difficult to pronounce it. No, it's not difficult, and who cares? Who cares? Who cares? I don't see how that's important. And I don't even think it's the case. GNU is just as easy to pronounce as any other arbitrary word. Now, but they might say that the GNU+Linux is too difficult, too long to say. Well, you don't have to pronounce the punctuation, just say GNU/Linux. And if you still find it difficult to say GNU, then you can just say the GNU. GNU/Linux. That's not difficult to pronounce. GNU/Linux. 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 It's not difficult to pronounce. GNU/Linux. You can repeat that. It's not difficult to pronounce. Things that are difficult to repeat, they are difficult to pronounce. Well, nah, that's not necessary too. But anyway, who cares? The point is, GNU/Linux is easy to pronounce. If you, for some reason, find it difficult to pronounce the GNU sound, the G in GNU, then just say GNU. It is an acronym after all. GNU's not Unix. That's the full name. And you can also use the full name too. Yeah. If you don't like to say GNU for some reason, you can say the full name. GNU's not Unix. You can say the full name. Yeah, that's also reasonable because it's an acronym. It's perfectly fine and valid and appropriate to pronounce it as the full name, GNU's not Unix, or as the separate letters for GNU, because it is an acronym. So yeah, I say that's perfectly fine. Yeah. So you have no excuses. GNU's not Unix, easy to pronounce. GNU/Linux and GNU in general, easy to pronounce. So the pronunciation nonsense, totally invalid. People are just too stupid, or rather, it's just an excuse, typically. I have a hard time believing these people actually care about the pronunciation all that much. But for the ones that do, I'm sure there are people who are different, like, people have different reasons. So for the people who genuinely have difficulty pronouncing it, just say GNU. And I'm not making fun of you, you can just say GNU. It's fine, I say GNU in Finnish often. GNU, GNU/Linux, GNU/Linux. That's how I often say it in Finnish. So I pronounce the letters differently. Of course, the letters sound different in Finnish, G instead of G, but still, you can do that if you have the genuine difficulties pronouncing the name for some reason. But for those people who just use it as an excuse, it would seem that they have some differences in opinion with the GNU philosophy and the free software movement and all that. So they don't want to draw attention to the GNU project. And, well, how do you discuss the operating system you like without drawing any attention to the people who founded it? Well, you just don't talk about the people who founded it. So that's very likely the reason many people don't actually want to talk about the GNU/Linux. It's not because the name is difficult to pronounce. It's not because this, that, and the other, the excuses. They just don't want to talk about the GNU operating system. Some people don't like Richard Stallman, so they don't want to give him credit. But I'm sure there are actually people who find it difficult to pronounce the name. There are many different people. There are many different people. So, I'm addressing each group separately. So right now I'm addressing the people who use them as excuses. So yeah. The name is not an excuse. You can pronounce it as GNU, or the full title, GNU's not Unix. So the naming is, the pronunciation is not an issue. Oh, but it's too long. GNU+Linux is not long. Microsoft's Windows, the Windows probably takes longer to pronounce than GNU+Linux. GNU+Linux, Windows, GNU+Linux. I don't know which one takes longer, and I don't care. It's not a significant difference, and it's not important. These are just excuses. They are excuses. And for those people who it's genuinely, I've already said it. Just say GNU+Linux if it's genuinely difficult for you to pronounce. But yeah, excuses. I might make a separate recording, my speech, where I explain why do people hate on Richard Stallman, but that's a separate issue. Anyway, back to the main topic of this speech. So, now that all those misunderstandings have been cleared, it should be easy to see why something like Mac OS, if it includes GNU software, it doesn't become a GNU operating system. Similarly, if there is FreeBSD software in a GNU+Linux distro, it doesn't make that GNU+Linux distro a FreeBSD operating system, now does it? Or if a FreeBSD distro includes some GNU software, that doesn't make FreeBSD a GNU operating system. You don't have to include every name of every software component and the name of every operating system where you have sourced software from in the fucking name of the operating system. That's not necessary. That's just not needed. Because what's important is the history, the background, the roots of the operating system, basically where it originates from. So you look at the history of GNU and you see that GNU is the start. Modern GNU+Linux. GNU starts it. It's the beginning. The GNU project is the beginning of the GNU+Linux operating system. Yeah, the biggest misunderstanding out there, actually, I'm gonna get into that also. The third big misunderstanding, that that Linux itself as a kernel is an operating system. Now that is the biggest misunderstanding, but that's not necessarily even a misunderstanding, that's just a disagreement on what it means, that what the operating system word means. That a term, it's not a single word, it's two words, operating system. That's a term. Never mind my terminology now. Or actually, do mind my terminology. Who gives a shit? Now, moving on. People think that a kernel is an operating system. Well, it's not. It's called a kernel. And there's a reason for the distinction. Operating system is the general environment for the user to interact with the computer hardware. This includes a kernel. A kernel is a component of an operating system. But a kernel itself is not a usable environment. It's just a kernel. It does what a kernel is supposed to do, and that is an important job. No one is saying that it's not an important job. In fact, on the contrary, I include Linux often in the name of GNU+Linux. Not always, depending on my use case, of course. But when I talk about the GNU+Linux operating system, and I'm specifically referring to the GNU+Linux variant of GNU that uses Linux, then I say GNU+Linux to indicate that it's specifically GNU+Linux, not the GNU operating system in general. Because GNU operating system in general includes all the different kernel variations, the FreeBSD kernel and the herd kernel and all those different kernels. So, no one is saying that the kernel isn't important. The kernel is very important, but it remains just a kernel. It is a component of an operating system. Now you might look up some stupid definitions by some stupid people. Well, I'm not saying that it's necessarily stupid. Who cares? Some stupid definitions of an operating system, which basically just define it as being the kernel. Well, those are stupid definitions. Now, the way the term operating system is actually used and has always been used, I might emphasize, the way the term operating system has always been used, which means that it's basically the correct use of the term because that's the way it's always been used ever since operating systems were first made. An operating system is the usable environment. The first operating systems were usable environments. So the term operating system has always been used to describe a usable operating system environment for the user. So you can't just later, decades into the computing... The fucking cat started making noise. Anyway, I don't know if you hear it. You can't just decades into the future, after operating systems and computers have been made for decades, you can't just change the definition because it doesn't align with your political views on GNU software philosophy. So, now let me get back to this topic itself now. So, the kernel is not an operating system. The distinction exists for a reason, and it ought to exist, how I just explained. The term operating system has always been used to describe a usable environment, and now I will provide examples. Do you call Microsoft's Windows by the name of the kernel? No. Do you call Android operating system by the name of the kernel? No. And here's a big one. A good one, because this operating system actually has a proper name for its kernel. Do you call Mac OS GNU? GNU is the name of the kernel of Mac OS. I've never heard anyone say that Mac OS is an GNU operating system. I've never heard that. Nobody has said that Mac OS is the GNU operating system. GNU is the name of the kernel, and if kernel is so important that it's the only thing that matters, that the operating system is the kernel is all that matters, well, why don't you call Mac OS the GNU? Nobody does that, because that's not the way the term operating system is ever used. It is a double standard for these people who think that the kernel is an operating system. It's basically a double standard. It only applies to the Linux kernel. Yeah, Mac OS, they don't call that GNU, despite the fact that the kernel of Mac OS is called GNU. If the kernel is so important as to be the only thing that matters, the only part of the system that is actually the operating system, why don't you call Mac OS the GNU? You should call the Mac OS the GNU. Otherwise, you are holding a double standard. And this is no surprise. I already I already discussed how these people, they don't like Richard Stallman's philosophical views, so they want to distance the software from him. And then they come up with excuses. These are the justifications, the excuses. But it's a double standard. They don't want to talk about Richard Stallman's GNU philosophy. So what do? They call it just Linux. That's a way to distance Richard Stallman's philosophical views from the operating system, by calling it from the wrong name, attributing the work to someone else. It wasn't made by Richard Stallman, it was made by Linus Torvalds, they say. Effectively, by calling it Linux, they attribute the work to him, Linus Torvalds. So, they don't wanna discuss it. So then, how do you justify this? By, of course, saying all this nonsense about how the kernel alone is an operating system. So that's the justification, the excuse, what is it called? What is this called? Is it an excuse, a justification, a rationalization? I don't know. Whatever it's called, this is that thing, the rationalization, the excuse, the justification. So they try to justify this wrong behavior by coming up with these elaborate, nonsensical views about how the kernel is an operating system and all this nonsense, despite the fact that the term operating system has never been used that way, ever, except specifically for that. And it is never even by those people used to describe other operating systems in a similar fashion. It only applies to the Linux kernel. Because it's a double standard. It's a double standard. They don't call the same people who talk about, quote, the Linux operating system, unquote, they don't call macOS GNU because it's a double standard. It only applies to the Linux kernel specifically because they don't want to talk about the GNU philosophy. They don't want to attribute the work to GNU project. Now there are, of course, like I said, there are many groups of people. Some groups of people might genuinely have difficulty pronouncing the title of the operating system. These are different groups of people, and of course each individual has their own personal opinions on all the issues. But I'm specifically talking about the group of people who I'm specifically talking about a single group of people. I'm not talking about everyone. There are people who might call the system, quote, Linux operating system, unquote, for different reasons. I've already discussed that. Now I'm discussing the people who... I'm discussing the specific group of people. But it goes even beyond just saying that... Just beyond other operating systems. You see, even operating systems that use the Linux kernel, such as Android, oftentimes a subgroup of this larger group of people who come up with these stupid excuses, they say that Android isn't a Linux operating system, despite them seeing the GNU+Linux as a Linux operating system. So in their view, of course, Android isn't a GNU+Linux operating system. It's just an operating system that uses the Linux kernel, just to clarify. But in their view, what the fuck? And this is of course nonsense. Not only is it a double standard that specifically applies to operating system with the Linux kernel, for some people, it even applies just to GNU+Linux specifically. So operating systems that use the Linux kernel, but are in some way undesirable in their eyes, they refuse to call even that a Linux system, as they put it. That's just ridiculous. Like, there's just so many stupid people. They're just ignorant idiots. Oh yes, and of course there are the masses, the general population, who have no idea what anyone is talking about. They just call it, quote, the Linux operating system, unquote, because that's just a popular way to call the system. But those people know anything about the subject. They don't have any arguments for it, nor do they have any arguments against it. That's just the name they've heard, so that's the name they use. Fine. They don't have any excuses. They just say what everyone else is saying, basically, from their point of view anyway. Of course, it's not everyone. There is no agreement here between the different groups of people. But now, as I was saying, idiots everywhere. Like, there are stupid people who have stupid reasons to say stupid shit. Look, the term operating system, it has been used for a long time to refer to many things. But the thing that all those many things have in common is that they are usable, complete operating system environments. Ever since the first operating systems, they have served the function of providing the computer user a fucking environment, a usable environment. That's how it has always been. You can't just change that terminology later because you don't like the GNU operating system, because you don't agree with Richard Stallman. You can't change that. No matter how many definitions some idiot might write that say only the kernel is an operating system, that's not the way the term operating system was ever used. You can't just change it like that because you disagree with Richard Stallman. So, stupid people, stupid idiots, all these morons with their stupid excuses and their stupid nonsense lies. And a blatant example of this, the double standard. You look no further than the obvious double standard. Who calls macOS GNU and also says that the kernel is an operating system alone? No one does that because it's a double standard. So, obviously, a double standard is an example of someone who doesn't have a coherent worldview, someone who relies on lies and deception and all that sort of nonsense. You can't even be honest with yourself if you have a double standard, because you apply a set of rules and you change those rules arbitrarily to fit the situation. But if there is an objective definition for what an operating system means, it doesn't change arbitrarily based on whose philosophy you don't like. If you don't like Richard Stallman's philosophy, but you have, if you don't like Richard Stallman's philosophy, that doesn't arbitrarily change the definition of operating system. Yeah, like these are mental fallacies. So me calling these people idiots is not unwarranted. Yeah, because like these are just objective facts that mental fallacies such as double standards, they are objectively like an example of someone who is wrong. Because if you're right, you don't need a double standard. You're just right always because it's the absolute truth, basically. You might be like, no, of course you might be mistaken and you believe you have the truth on your side when you don't, but a double standard is an example of someone, but having a double standard is an example of someone who is not generally right, because why would you need a double standard if you're right? If you're correct, if you are correct, you can just rely on the truth. The truth is on your side, so you don't need a double standard. So people who have double standards, and I have pointed out how it is a double standard, unless there is someone who does call macOS the GNU operating system, to that person I say, well, you don't seem to have a double standard. You're just a moron who ignores the history of how the term operating system has been used, but at least you don't have a double standard. We have a disagreement on what the operating system term means. I have the history on my side, and you have your weird views on your side. So I believe I'm still right in that case, because I have the history of how the term operating system has been used on my side. It has always been used to refer to fully complete operating system environments. So I have the history on my side. And you just say that, well, I don't agree with that. I say the operating system is only the kernel. Okay, well, that's a disagreement then. But, I disagree with you then. Okay, so that's to that person. But that person might be a very, 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 very small minority, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the population who actually calls macOS the GNU operating system. I've never heard that said. So, okay, that person might exist. Who knows? But who cares? I still have the history on my side. The term operating system has always been used to refer to full, complete operating system environments. And most people have the double standard. So, these people are just idiots. They have their political and philosophical disagreements with Richard Stallman and his views. And then they come up with stupid, nonsensical mental fallacies, double standards, and stupid excuses that ignore history of how the term operating system has been used. All that stuff. Like, people are idiots. People are just stupid. They don't think straight. And they are idiots. They are idiots. Stupid morons. Why don't they just... Why do people have such difficulty looking at things straight? Why? Well, because they don't like Richard Stallman, and they just come up with all these nonsense excuses. Yeah. Also, there might be the few people who actually genuinely find it difficult to pronounce the name. Yeah, those people probably don't have any double standards. Those people might not have any mental fallacies. They just genuinely don't find it easy. But I'm still not saying that they are right. I'm not saying it's right to pronounce it wrong. I mean, to misrepresent the word. Even if you genuinely find it difficult to pronounce the name GNU for some reason, which is just a nonsense excuse still, because you can just say GNU. But even if you find it difficult to pronounce, that doesn't mean that it's not the name. Hey, you can write it. Write it. So every time you're on the internet discussing the thing, you can still write it as the GNU operating system if you find it difficult to pronounce. So that's interesting. But yeah, even if you find it difficult to pronounce, that's still no reason to misrepresent the name, because that is the name. GNU is the name. Or GNU. GNU is just fine. So, I think that should more or less conclude my speech. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the end of this speech. So, yeah, well, thanks for listening. I hope you agree. Goodbye now. For now, anyway.